Imagine paying $24 for the most valuable real estate on the planet. Not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech. In 1626, a Dutch official named Peter Minuit handed a group of Lenape people a collection of trade goods worth roughly 60 guilders and walked away with the entire island of Manhattan. 60 guilders. Some historians estimate that converts to about $24 in modern terms. And today, the land he bought is worth somewhere in the range of $1.7 trillion. That is not a typo. 1.7 trillion. For 60 guilders worth of kettles, cloth, and beads. Now here is the part nobody talks about. The Lenape almost certainly had no idea they were selling anything at all. They believed they were entering a seasonal use agreement, the kind their people made all the time. So who actually tricked whom? And what really happened on that island in the years that followed? Because here is what the textbooks skip. New Amsterdam, the little Dutch trading post that became New York City, was not just a colonial settlement. It was something far stranger and far more interesting. It was the most cosmopolitan, chaotic, morally complicated, and surprisingly modern city in the entire Western Hemisphere, more than 3 centuries before the word cosmopolitan even became fashionable. At its peak, this tiny settlement of fewer than 10,000 people spoke more than 18 languages on its streets. It had Jewish refugees, enslaved Africans who somehow negotiated their partial freedom, indigenous traders, pirates, Quakers, Lutherans, Catholics, and hard-drinking sailors from every port on the Atlantic. It was not a utopia. It was something more interesting than a utopia. It was a mess. A glorious, violent, profitable, contradictory mess. And by the time this story is over, you are going to look at the New York City skyline and see it completely differently. What you are about to hear is not the sanitized version taught in schools. This is the story of the real people who built that city. The ones who were there before the Dutch arrived. The ones who were dragged there in chains. The ones who came seeking fortune and found something they never expected. And the one man who nearly destroyed everything before an empire stepped in and changed the map of North America forever. Stay with this story, because the twist at the end, the real reason New York became New York, is something almost no one knows. And when you hear it, you will not believe it took this long for someone to tell you. To understand New Amsterdam, you have to go back even further than 1626. You have to go back to 1609, to a restless English sailor named Henry Hudson, who was working, of all things, for the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials VOC, was the most powerful corporation in the world at that moment. Not just the most powerful trading company. The most powerful corporation, full stop. It had its own army, its own navy, its own judicial system, and the legal authority to wage war, sign treaties, and colonize territory on behalf of the Dutch Republic. It was essentially a sovereign nation that also happened to sell spices. And in 1609, the VOC sent Henry Hudson west to find a shortcut to Asia, because the ones they had were getting expensive to defend. Hudson did not find a shortcut to Asia. What he found instead was a long silver river cutting deep into a continent nobody in Europe fully understood yet. He sailed that river for weeks, past forests so thick and rivers so teeming with fish that his crew wrote about it in their journals with something close to religious awe. He reached approximately where Albany, New York stands today, before the river became too shallow to navigate further. He turned back. He reported to the VOC that there was no shortcut to Asia. But, he added, there was something else entirely. There was a land so rich in beaver pelts, so perfectly situated at the mouth of a navigable river, so naturally defensible with its harbor and its island, that any trading nation that planted a flag there would become very, very wealthy. The VOC listened, and then, because corporations are corporations, they filed the report and did almost nothing with it for over a decade. That decade of inaction matters, because while the VOC was busy counting guilders in Amsterdam, other Europeans were already nosing around the same territory. The French had Champlain working the northern approaches. The English had their Virginian and Plymouth settlements creeping northward. The window for Dutch dominance in the region was not going to stay open forever, and a small group of Dutch merchants knew it. These were not noble adventurers. They were men who looked at maps the way a hawk looks at a field, calculating angles, distances, profit margins. In 1614, they formed the New Netherland Company and sent ships to the river Hudson had charted. They built a tiny fort, Fort Nassau, near present-day Albany, and started trading for beaver pelts. Not colonizing, not building, just trading. This distinction mattered enormously, and it would haunt Dutch efforts in North America for the next 50 years. The beaver pelt trade was not a small thing. It was, in the early 17th century, one of the most lucrative businesses in the known world. European aristocracy had developed a ferocious appetite for felt hats made from beaver underfur, and the European beaver was basically extinct. The forests of North America were full of them. The Lenape, the Mohawk, the Mohican, and dozens of other indigenous nations had been hunting and trading in this region for thousands of years, and they understood its geography with an intimacy that no European mapmaker could match. When Dutch traders arrived with metal tools, woolen cloth, copper kettles, and later guns, they were not introducing commerce to a people who had none. They were inserting themselves into a trading network that already stretched from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. The Dutch were, in the beginning, junior partners in a game the indigenous nations had been playing for centuries. This is the first thing the textbooks get wrong. The Lenape people who were on Manhattan when European ships began appearing in the harbor were not passive, confused bystanders watching history happen to them. They were traders, diplomats, and strategists who made careful decisions about which Europeans to engage with and on what terms. The Lenape had already survived contact with European disease, which had swept through the northeastern woodlands in waves before most Europeans even knew the region existed. They had watched entire villages disappear. They had reorganized, adapted, and continued. When Peter Minuit arrived in 1626 to negotiate the arrangement that Europeans would later call a sale, the Lenape leadership almost certainly understood that the Dutch wanted something. What they may not have understood was the European legal concept of permanent, exclusive ownership of land. In Lenape cosmology, land was not something a person or a group could own the way they owned a knife or a canoe. It was something you used, shared, and moved through seasonally. The exchange of goods for territorial access was not unknown to them, but they likely believed they were granting seasonal use rights, not surrendering sovereignty forever. The Dutch thought otherwise, and that misunderstanding would eventually cost the Lenape everything. But in 1626, none of that catastrophe had fully arrived yet. Peter Minuit stepped ashore on a warm spring day, conducted his negotiations, and then turned to the business of building a colony. And here is where the character of New Amsterdam begins to emerge, because Minuit and the men who sent him were making it up as they went along. The West India Company, which had replaced the earlier New Netherland Company and received a monopoly charter from the Dutch government in 1621, had competing priorities. Its primary business was raiding Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The profits from piracy, let us call it what it was, were so enormous that the company's directors, the Heren 19, the 19 gentlemen who ran the operation from their offices in Amsterdam, were never quite sure how much attention to devote to their little settlement on the Hudson. New Amsterdam was, to them, a useful way station, a place to resupply ships, a source of furs, but not a strategic priority. And that attitude shaped everything that followed. The early years of New Amsterdam were, by almost every account, brutal. The settlers who arrived in the 1620s were not idealists seeking religious freedom, not heroic pioneers driven by manifest destiny. They were employees of a corporation. The West India Company recruited whoever it could find, which meant a mixed bag of Dutch burghers, Walloon refugees from the Spanish Netherlands, German labourers, Scandinavian sailors, and assorted other Europeans who had reasons to leave home. They arrived on a marshy, densely forested island at the mouth of a river, surrounded by peoples they did not understand, dependent on a supply chain that stretched 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, and answerable to directors in Amsterdam who cared primarily about profits. The mortality rate in the first years was staggering. Disease, malnutrition, and conflict with neighboring indigenous communities killed settlers with grim regularity. The colony nearly collapsed multiple times in its first decade. What saved it, improbably, was the beaver. The demand for pelts in Europe was so intense, and the profits so reliable, that the West India Company kept sending ships, kept sending people, kept investing in a settlement that seemed perpetually on the verge of disaster. And in the process, despite themselves, they created something genuinely remarkable. Because unlike the English colonies to the north and south, which were built around religious homogeneity and ethnic solidarity, New Amsterdam was built around trade. And trade, by its nature, does not care who you are. It cares whether you have something to sell and something to buy. This created a culture of extraordinary, if imperfect, tolerance. The colony needed people, any people, people who could farm, build, trade, navigate, fight. Where they came from, what language they spoke, what god they prayed to, was, in theory at least, secondary to whether they could do useful work. In theory. The reality, as always, was messier and darker. The West India Company brought enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam beginning in the 1620s, just years after the colony was founded. These were not the last enslaved people brought to Manhattan. They were the first in a long, terrible chain. The company purchased enslaved people primarily from West and Central Africa, men and women who had survived the Middle Passage and arrived in the colony as property, to be worked on company farms, in company construction projects, building the fort, the docks, the roads. Their labor was essential to the colony's survival. Without it, the settlement would almost certainly have failed in its first decade. And yet, their presence in the story of New Amsterdam is routinely buried under more comfortable narratives. The truth is that slavery was foundational to New Amsterdam, in the same way it was foundational to every European colony in the Americas. There was nothing exceptional about this. What was exceptional, and genuinely strange, was what came next. A group of enslaved men and women in New Amsterdam, sometime in the 1640s, submitted a formal petition to the West India Company. They wrote in Dutch. They argued, using the company's own legal framework, that they had served the company faithfully for many years and that they deserved their freedom, or at least a kind of conditional freedom, a status the Dutch called half-freedom. The 19 gentlemen in Amsterdam, looking at their ledgers and calculating the cost of maintaining enslaved workers versus the cost of a potential uprising in a colony that was already dangerously short of loyal defenders, made a pragmatic decision. They granted it. A group of enslaved men, including men named Peter Stuyvesant, Jan Francisco, Groot Manuel, and others received their conditional freedom. They received land grants in what is now Lower Manhattan, in the area around what is today Greenwich Village. Their children, however, remained enslaved. It was not freedom. It was a negotiation, a compromise, a half-measure that revealed everything about the contradictions at the heart of New Amsterdam. But it happened. And it happened nowhere else in the colonial Americas at that time. To understand why New Amsterdam was as strange as it was, you have to understand the Dutch Republic itself. In the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was the most unusual political entity in the Western world. It was not a kingdom. It had no king. It was a federation of provinces governed by merchant oligarchies, held together by trade and a shared history of fighting Spanish domination. The Dutch had just finished 80 years of war against the Spanish Empire, and they had won, against the most powerful military force in the world. And what they had built in the aftermath was something that looked, to the horrified monarchies of Europe, dangerously like a republic of money. A place where wealth mattered more than bloodline, where religious minorities, provided they kept their worship private and their businesses profitable, could live and work without being burned at the stake. Spinoza, the philosopher who argued that the Bible was written by human beings, lived and published his work in Amsterdam without being executed. That would have been impossible in any other major European city of the era. The Dutch were not tolerant because they were saints. They were tolerant because tolerance was good for business. And they exported that philosophy, for better and for worse, to their colony on the Hudson. This is why, in 1654, a ship arrived in the harbor of New Amsterdam carrying 23 Jewish refugees fleeing the Inquisition in Recife, Brazil, after the Portuguese recaptured the city from the Dutch. These men, women, and children had nothing. They had fled with their lives, and very little else. And they sailed into New Amsterdam because they knew the Dutch reputation. They knew that in Dutch territory, Jews could live. Not freely, not equally, but they could live. Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of the colony at the time, a grim, pious, one-legged man who despised Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and most of humanity with equal ferocity, tried to throw them out. He wrote to the West India Company, demanding permission to expel them. He called them a deceitful race, a drain on the community, a threat to good Christian order. The 19 gentlemen wrote back. They told him no. They told him, in very polite but unmistakable corporate language, that Jewish merchants held shares in the West India Company, that Jewish communities in Amsterdam were powerful economic actors, and that if Stuyvesant expelled these refugees, he would be creating diplomatic and commercial problems the company did not want. The Jews stayed. New Amsterdam had its first permanent Jewish community, and Peter Stuyvesant, furious and overruled, had to live with it. Peter Stuyvesant deserves his own chapter in this story because he is one of the most fascinating, infuriating, and strangely sympathetic figures in early American history. He arrived in New Amsterdam in 1647 with a wooden leg, a terrible temper, a genuine love for the colony he would come to call home, and a style of governance that his citizens compared, not favorably, to a military dictatorship. He had lost his leg during a military campaign in the Caribbean, fighting for the West India Company, and the wound had never quite healed in his soul. He walked with a silver-banded peg leg that he wore like a badge of honor and a mark of sacrifice. He was a deeply religious man, a Calvinist of the strictest variety, and he genuinely believed that order, discipline, and the correct worship of God were the foundations of a good society. He was also, by any measurable standard, a terrible politician. Stuyvesant banned Quakers from holding religious meetings. He tried to ban Lutherans from public worship. He arrested a man named John Bown for hosting Quaker gatherings in his house in Flushing, which is today a neighborhood in Queens, and deported him to the Netherlands as a criminal. He imposed taxes without consultation, jailed critics, and generally ruled New Amsterdam as though it were a military garrison rather than a trading colony. His citizens were not passive about this. They complained loudly and in writing. A group of colonists in Flushing drafted what became known as the Flushing Remonstrance in 1657, a document that argued, nearly a century and a quarter before the American Declaration of Independence, that the civil authority had no right to impose religious belief on the people. The Flushing Remonstrance was, in many ways, the first statement of religious liberty in North American history, and it was written in direct response to the tyranny of Peter Stuyvesant. The West India Company, again, overruled him. John Bown was allowed to return to Flushing. The Quakers were allowed to worship, and Stuyvesant seethed. But here is the thing about Peter Stuyvesant that makes him impossible to simply dismiss as a villain. He loved New Amsterdam. He loved it more than anyone else in the colony's leadership loved it. He planted orchards. He built a canal along what is today Broad Street. He pushed through laws regulating fire safety and sanitation. He negotiated, with genuine skill, the Treaty of Hartford in 1650, which finally settled the border disputes between New Amsterdam and the English colonies of Connecticut and New Haven. He was, in many ways, the first actual administrator the colony had ever had, the first Director General who treated it as a real place rather than a revenue source. And when the end came, when the moment arrived that would change the trajectory of the entire continent, his reaction was the most human, the most devastating thing in this whole story. Before we get to that end, we need to understand the world that New Amsterdam existed in, because it was not a peaceful one. The colony sat at the center of a web of tensions that stretched in every direction. To the north and northeast, the English colonies of New England were growing fast, fed by a constant stream of Puritan immigrants fleeing persecution in England. To the south, the English were building Virginia and Maryland into plantation societies of enormous wealth and political ambition. And to the west and north, the indigenous nations of the region were watching all of these Europeans with a mixture of strategic calculation and growing dread, because the more Europeans arrived, the more the old balances of power shifted in dangerous ways. The relationship between New Amsterdam and the Lenape was never simple. In the colony's early years, it had been characterized by trade, negotiation, and a kind of armed mutual respect. The Dutch needed the Lenape's knowledge of the land, their trade networks, and their willingness to supply furs. The Lenape needed Dutch-manufactured goods, and increasingly, Dutch guns. But as the colony grew, as Dutch farms began eating into Lenape hunting territories, and as misunderstandings about land ownership piled up, the relationship deteriorated. In 1640, a conflict now known as Kieft's War exploded across the region, and it was almost entirely the fault of one man. Willem Kieft was the Director General before Stuyvesant, and if Stuyvesant was a difficult authoritarian, Kieft was something worse. He was an impulsive, vindictive man who had been sent to New Amsterdam after failing in business in the Netherlands, a fact that tells you something about how seriously the West India Company took the colony's governance in those years. Kieft decided to resolve the tensions with the Lenape by demanding that they pay a tribute to the Dutch for the protection the colony supposedly provided them. The Lenape, unsurprisingly, refused. This was their land. They did not need Dutch protection. Kieft's response was to order a massacre. In February of 1643, Dutch soldiers attacked a group of Lenape refugees who had fled to the Dutch settlement seeking protection from Mohican raiders. These were not warriors. They were families. Women, children, elderly people. The soldiers killed approximately 80 people, decapitated many of the dead, and brought the severed heads back to New Amsterdam as trophies. A Dutch woman named Maren Adriaansen, who witnessed the aftermath, later testified that she had seen soldiers kick the heads of the dead through the streets like footballs. Kieft reportedly watched from his window and applauded. The reaction among the Dutch settlers was horror. Several prominent colonists, including the farmer and writer David de Vries, confronted Kieft directly and told him he had committed an atrocity that would bring ruin on them all. They were right. The Lenape retaliated with devastating effectiveness. Kieft's War, which lasted until 1645, killed hundreds of colonists and effectively destroyed Dutch expansion in the region for years. Kieft was eventually recalled to the Netherlands, and the ship carrying him back to Amsterdam sank in a storm in the Bristol Channel in 1647. He drowned. Almost everyone who knew him considered this poetically appropriate. Peter Stuyvesant arrived to pick up the pieces, and pick them up he did, with characteristic, iron-handed efficiency. He rebuilt the colony's defenses, negotiated peace with the surrounding indigenous nations, expanded the settlement, and transformed New Amsterdam from a struggling corporate outpost into something that genuinely resembled a city. By the 1650s, New Amsterdam had a city hall, a market, a ferry to Long Island, a proper wall along the northern edge of the settlement, built by enslaved laborers, along the line of what is today Wall Street, and a population that included people from every corner of the Atlantic world. It had taverns, churches, a school, a hospital, a windmill, and some of the most spectacular waterfront real estate on the continent. It was, by any measure of its time, a success. A messy, contentious, perpetually underfunded success, but a success. And yet, the colony had a fundamental structural weakness that no amount of Peter Stuyvesant's administrative energy could fix. The West India Company had never been willing to invest in New Amsterdam the way the English Crown invested in its colonial projects, or the way the French government invested in New France. The company's model was extraction and trade, not settlement and empire. It had never sent enough settlers, never built enough defenses, never given the colony enough autonomy to attract the kind of determined, long-term immigrant population that was transforming the English settlements to the north and south. By the early 1660s, the English colonies of New England and Virginia together had a population of around 50,000 people. New Amsterdam had perhaps 9,000. The math was not encouraging. In England, a man named Charles II had been restored to the throne in 1660 after the chaos of the Civil War and the Cromwell Protectorate. Charles was charming, intelligent, perpetually short of money, and deeply interested in the possibilities of North American colonization. He looked at the map of the eastern seaboard and noticed something that bothered him enormously. Right in the middle of his colonial possessions, wedged between New England and Virginia like a splinter, sat this Dutch colony. A Dutch colony that was, according to his advisors, extremely profitable. A Dutch colony that, according to his intelligence, was extremely poorly defended. And a Dutch colony that, according to his own interpretation of English history, was sitting on land that England had claimed first, because of John Cabot's voyages in 1497, which Charles felt gave England prior claim to the whole eastern seaboard. Dutch settlements be damned. In 1664, Charles II granted his brother James, Duke of York, a massive land grant that covered, among other territories, all of New Netherland, the entire Dutch colony. He gave his brother land that England did not actually possess, that was actively settled and governed by another European nation, on the grounds that England had discovered it first and therefore owned it, regardless of who was living there. This was, legally and morally, an act of extraordinary brazenness. And then he sent 4 warships and 500 soldiers to collect. The English fleet arrived in the harbor of New Amsterdam in late August of 1664. Its commander, Colonel Richard Nichols, was a cool, professional soldier who had been instructed to take the colony by negotiation, if possible, and by force, if necessary. He sent a message to Stuyvesant. Surrender. The terms were generous, Nichols promised. The settlers would keep their property, their religion, their language, their laws. The Dutch would simply have new masters. It was a business proposal, dressed up in military uniform. And here is where the story reaches its most extraordinary, most human, and most heartbreaking moment. Stuyvesant read Nichols's message, and then he tore it up. He literally tore it into pieces and refused to show it to his citizens, because he had already decided he would fight. One man, one wooden-legged, silver-haired, deeply principled man, against 4 warships and 500 soldiers, with a garrison of fewer than 150 defenders and not enough gunpowder to last a significant engagement. He climbed the wall of his fort and prepared to order his gunners to fire. He was going to defend this city. His city. The city he had spent 17 years building and fighting for, and loving with the furious, possessive love of a man who has given his best years to something he created. And then, his own people stopped him. A delegation of colonists, led by his own son, Balthazar, climbed the wall and physically confronted him. They showed him the letter he had torn up. Other copies had been obtained. The colonists had read Nichols's terms, and they had decided. The terms were fair. The colony was indefensible. To fight was to die for a company that had never truly valued them, for a government 3,000 miles away that had never sent them enough soldiers or enough money. They refused to fire. They pleaded with him. 93 of the colony's leading citizens signed a petition urging surrender, and Peter Stuyvesant, the most stubborn man in the Western Hemisphere, looked at his city, looked at the fleet in the harbor, looked at his son's face, and put down the match. On September 8, 1664, New Amsterdam became New York. No shot was fired. The Dutch flag came down. The English flag went up. Colonel Nichols renamed the colony in honor of his patron, the Duke of York, and prepared to take possession of the most strategically valuable piece of real estate in North America. And Peter Stuyvesant, stripped of his authority, given a polite English escort, and sent home to his farm on the Bowery, which is today the Bowery in Lower Manhattan, sat down in the soil he loved and quietly wept. This is the moment the textbooks treat as an ending. The Dutch lost, the English won. New Amsterdam became New York. The end. But that is not the end. Because here is the thing that almost no one ever talks about. The Dutch got it back. In 1673, a Dutch fleet sailed into the harbor, kicked out the English garrison, and for 15 months, New York was Dutch again. They renamed it New Orange in honor of the Dutch royal house. They appointed a governor. They issued proclamations. For 15 months, it was as though the surrender of 1664 had never happened. And then, in the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, the Dutch traded New Orange back to the English in exchange for Suriname, a sugar-producing colony in South America. They made a business decision. They calculated that the sugar revenues of Suriname outweighed the strategic value of the Hudson River settlement, and they signed it away forever. Think about that for a moment. The Dutch chose Suriname over Manhattan. They had Manhattan back in their hands, and they gave it away for a sugar colony. Historians have argued about this decision ever since, and the consensus is that in the economic logic of 1674, it was not obviously wrong. Suriname was enormously profitable. Sugar was the oil of the 17th century. But the long-term consequences were staggering. The Dutch gave up New York, and New York went on to become New York. So here is the real question this story has been building toward. When you look at New York City today, when you see the most diverse, most energetic, most commercially ferocious city on the planet, and you ask yourself where that character came from, the real answer is not the English colonial era. The English tried, actually, to make New York more like their other colonies, more hierarchical, more homogeneous, more controlled. They largely failed. Because by the time the English arrived, the culture of New Amsterdam was already baked into the island. The diversity was already there. The commercial ruthlessness was already there. The habit of tolerance as a business strategy was already there. The tradition of arguing with authority, of petitioning, of demanding rights, of refusing to be silenced by powerful men, was already there. In the Flushing Remonstrance, in the petitions of the enslaved men who won their half-freedom, in the document the settlers thrust into Peter Stuyvesant's hands on the wall of the fort. New York is Dutch in its bones. Not in its language, not in its street names, though some of those survive too. The Bowery from Bowery, Harlem from Harlem, Brooklyn from Breukelen, the Bronx from a Dutch settler named Jonas Bronk. But in its spirit, in its fundamental belief that the city belongs to everyone who can make something of themselves there, in its suspicion of authority, combined with its dependence on commerce, in its insistence on being, above all else, open for business. These are Dutch values. They came across the Atlantic on company ships, embedded in the character of a trading republic that built a city not to glorify God or king, but to make money. And in doing so, accidentally created something far more durable and far more extraordinary than they ever intended. So here is where we land. $24 for Manhattan. An enslaved people who petitioned for their freedom and partly won. A Jewish community that survived because a corporation valued its shareholders. A man with a wooden leg who loved a city so much he was willing to die for it, and whose citizens loved it enough to stop him. A trade made by a nation that chose sugar over the greatest city in the world. Every one of these stories happened on the same island. Every one of these stories is a piece of what New York became. And when you walk down those streets today, past the banks and the bodegas and the synagogues and the mosques and the jazz clubs and the courthouses, you are walking through the accumulated weight of all of it. Every decision, every betrayal, every act of courage and cowardice and pragmatism and love. Was New Amsterdam a good place? No, not by any honest accounting. It had slavery at its foundations. It had massacres and corruption and disease and injustice woven into its earliest years. But it was also, in flashes, something genuinely ahead of its time. It was a place where people who had no business being in the same room looked at each other across a trading table and decided to deal. And that instinct, that willingness to engage with the stranger because the stranger might have something you need, that became New York. And New York became the world. Think about it this way. The next time someone tells you the story of New York is an American story, a story about English settlers and revolutionary colonists and westward expansion, you know something they do not. The deepest roots of that city are Dutch. They are buried under 350 years of English street signs and American mythology, but they are there, planted by a corporation, watered by profit, and shaped, more than anyone planned, by the ordinary people, the enslaved, the Jewish, the Quaker, the indigenous, the Dutch, the German, the African, the desperate and the ambitious and the stubborn, who decided that this island was worth fighting for. Now here is the question I want to leave you with. If the Dutch had held on to New Amsterdam, if they had never surrendered to the English fleet, if Peter Stuyvesant had fired that cannon and forced a military conflict, if the colony had somehow survived and grown under Dutch rule, what would New York look like today? Would it be more tolerant, more commercial, more chaotic? Or would it have collapsed entirely, consumed by the same contradictions that made it so fascinating? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story changed the way you see one of the most famous cities on Earth, then this channel is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Subscribe to Cradle of Democracy and go watch our video on the real story of the Mayflower, because everything you think you know about those pilgrims is about to get very complicated, very fast.